connection. Many of you will know our next speaker, David Brough, long association with the wall, as both a resident and somebody who has made a living from the wall, like many of us, in the best possible way. The wall continues to work for us economically, and so David definitely has Hadrian's Wall in his DNA, in his soul, and the latest project that he's been developing on all our behalves is this project that he's doing with Newcastle University, which is around World Heritage sites and the entire purpose of World Heritage, which is peace. And in this week, more than any, this is such an apposite topic. So David, we'd like to hand over to you now, please, to begin the presentation. As usual, we'd like comments and questions, please, in the chat, but there will also be time at the end of David's presentation for us to have that community conversation where we unmute and ask David questions directly. But you know the form now, most of you. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. This presentation really kind of picks up where Matt Rabaliati from the UK Commission left us on Saturday. Oh, come on. Yep, okay, right. That's, yep. This project is being led by Peter Stone, who I think will be familiar to most of you, Jane's predecessor, but one as chair of the Hadrian's Wall Partnership. As you can see from this slide, Peter's main focus is around the cultural property protection agenda, which in recent years has taken him, well, has had him involved in Iraq, Syria, latterly in Afghanistan, and in the last 8 days in regard to Crimea. And the peace element of his work is really in the minority there. This is what I'm going to take you through today. I'll not read it, but that's just to give you an idea of what I'm going to cover. This really all starts with the foundation of UNESCO in December 1945 in London, literally and figuratively amidst the rubble of the Second World War. And this quotation here is line 1 of page 1 of the first document that UNESCO produced. And what a lot of people don't appreciate is that this sentence was apparently written by Clement Attlee, then UK Prime Minister. Usually that's all that is quoted from the document, which is the preamble to UNESCO's founding constitution. And the rest of that preamble is very rarely looked at. I've just picked out a couple of paragraphs from that. I'll just quickly gallop through those. That ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout the history of mankind of that suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world through which their differences have all too often broken into war. And a further paragraph urges nations to develop and to increase the means of communication between their peoples and to employ these means for the purposes of mutual understanding and a truer and more perfect knowledge of each other's lives. Why don't we use language like that today? Disturbingly, it's very difficult to find this preamble. It took me about 25 minutes to find it with fairly extensive searching on the internet. So I've included there the link to it to save you each the 25 minutes, but it's well worth a look at that. And Kerry's just sharing that with you in the chat. So a pretty promising start. There was peace, front and center of what UNESCO was about. What's happened since, however, in relation to peace and UNESCO is pretty disappointing. And in fact, only 2 of the many hundreds of publications and official documentations and guidance and policy documents that UNESCO have produced, this is jumping ahead. Can I take it back? Don't know that I can. There we go. Only 2 of those documents have mentioned peace. The first wasn't until 1998 with the production of the document you see on the screen. And it contained one of its elements in relation to World Heritage and a culture of peace. Unsurprisingly, one of the authors of that was a certain Peter Stone. It's not moving. Come on, move. Oh, there we go. Of UNESCO's 6 cultural conventions, only one of them, and that's the one highlighted at the bottom, makes any reference to peace. And significantly, if you look at the World Heritage Convention 1972, the word peace does not appear. The 2005 Convention on Cultural Diversity makes one mention of peace as one of its 9 objectives. So although it's there, it ain't featuring particularly prominently. Peace is not part of UNESCO's global priorities, overall themes, mission, or its 5 Cs, the strategic objectives. Nor is it mentioned in the nomination process, the management plan processes, UNESCO's or the World Heritage Centre's top-level thinking. That's their sort of public pronouncements and whatever. The word peace does occur in the operational guidelines. It occurs once, but only as an aside. I think it's actually in a footnote. And also, significantly, sites have generally focused their presentation and interpretation quite naturally on their own history or archaeology and their own significance. And until relatively recently, sites have rarely mentioned UNESCO or indeed World Heritage, let alone talked about peace. I don't think really we have the time to try and say, why has this happened or why has this not happened? And anyway, I think rather than wringing our hands about what has not happened in the past, we should really be focusing our attentions and energies at what might happen in the future or what we do now. There's been a little bit of recent progress. The first on the 60th anniversary of the foundation of UNESCO, from Irina Bokova. And then more recently, just at the end of last year, some further reference in work coming out of the committee that Peter works with on the 1954 Hague Convention. So some signs of hope in that regard. I'm just going to check my notes. Okay. So these are questions that Peter likes to ask in this context. And he's quite keen to encourage people to think of World Heritage as a two-way process, and also to, perhaps paraphrasing John F. Kennedy, to say, ask not what UNESCO and World Heritage status can do for you, but what you can do for UNESCO and World Heritage. And keen to encourage people to begin to think about the potential for World Heritage sites to be acting as ambassadors for peace. The work I'm going to mainly talk about to you today was preceded by an initial research project which Peter instigated, which was undertaken by one of our colleagues, Valentina Sabuco, in 2019. And Valentina did an extraordinary task. She reviewed all available management documentation and nomination documents for all the cultural and mixed World Heritage sites. She didn't read it all. She did simply a word search of all this documentation. And there were two pretty striking findings from this. Although around 160 sites made reference to peace, this was normally within their discussions of their attributes, or indeed within their statements of significance. And only 16 out of those 800 plus specifically acknowledged UNESCO's founding objective, and 6 of these were in the UK. So this left us with a big fat question: why? That then led us to the next stage of our investigations. Peter managed to secure a very modest amount of funding from Newcastle University, and I was commissioned to do some further research on this. The research focused only on UK World Heritage sites. I firstly had a look at the most recent management plans for all our sites, and unsurprisingly, there was little change from what Valentina had come up with 2 years previously, not least because, against the background of COVID, very few sites had actually been able to update their management plans. And the main part of my work was to interview UK World Heritage sites, to explore the 3 questions that we have there. What is currently happening, if anything? What might be inhibiting sites from doing more to support UNESCO's founding objective? And from that, what might then assist them to address those barriers? So I'm going to go through some of the main findings of that research last summer. Current activities, unsurprisingly, little is being done to support, to explicitly promote peace. But what was very interesting was that a good number of sites are already undertaking, to different degrees, activities which promote understanding of and between different cultures. And you're going to hear me using that phrase quite a bit as I go through this. And the other broad consensus was that there is general interest in looking at what more they could do. In terms of the barriers which were hitherto preventing people from doing more, firstly, as we've already alluded to, although, as John will tell you, or anyone really who's directly involved in the sort of management, the direct management of a World Heritage site, you're already faced with more than enough policy to have to respond to and conform with. Thank you very much. But despite that, there is no clear policy guidance in relation to the promotion of peace agenda. None. A very interesting point was raised early in my research by our colleague Jane Masters from New Lanark World Heritage Site, who said, you know, the promotion of peace, that's a pretty abstract concept. What on earth does that mean? And Jane also said, you know, if I'm struggling to make sense of what that means, then how on earth are my audiences, my constituencies, my communities, my stakeholders, how are they going to kind of get a hold of this? And this issue of language, I think, is perhaps one of the key issues that's come up in all of this. As we've already established, people were saying, well, we haven't got any examples of good practice that we can build on and follow. A further point, and a number of sites emphasized this, was that whatever they do must be of relevance to their own constituencies and their own audiences. And they were struggling to see how such a broad and grand agenda as the promotion of peace could relate back to their own sites. Tony Crouch at Bath said, you know, here we are in, you know, the tranquility of southwest England, and, you know, peace ain't really an issue for people in the street. And unsurprisingly, they also identified the perennial issue of just a lack of resources, not simply in terms of cash, but in terms of pairs of hands and hours in the day, and many more pressing priorities. Kind of coming out of that, we then had a poke around what colleagues felt might help them do more to support this agenda. Picking up from Jane Masters' point at New Lanark, a strong feeling that we really need to change the focus, or more particularly the language, from the abstract promotion of peace to something perhaps like enhancing understanding of and between different cultures, or, as another colleague suggested, simply fostering greater dialogue between cultures. I think we're still, to be honest, struggling to find the correct kind of language that we need to use here, and particularly recognizing that to different audiences will perhaps have to use different language, and the language may well differ between World Heritage Sites. Following on, again coming from the barriers, if we could somehow find a way of giving some examples or even just ideas about what people could do, that would be a big help, and give people a kind of starting point. A clearer articulation of the benefits of doing anything on this agenda, and again, specifically the benefits to individual sites and their stakeholders and constituencies. And then just at a very basic level, and this kind of relates back to the first point about language, providing sites with some basic material about, if you like, why God created UNESCO and what its fundamental objectives are. They also came up with some things that would not help. And I think this is, I think it's always important to consider what you shouldn't be doing, if you see what I mean. Quite a strong feeling that they really don't want another set of policy that they have to adhere to. You know, that life's too short. They've got enough already. Also a feeling that people felt, you know, any sort of blueprint that they might be expected to use or adopt ain't going to work for everyone, each site is different, and each site is operating in a different context with different attributes, etc. And each site has to do things to suit their own circumstances. The third point was again widely expressed, and I think the most significant part of this point is around how whatever they might do might fit within their existing activities. And a colleague from Her Majesty's Royal Palaces, which are responsible for the Tower of London, said, anything that we do in this regard must not mean that we have to break step with what we are already doing. And I thought that was quite an interesting phrase. And then again, echoing the point made earlier, they are not really able to, nor should they, embark on anything which isn't of benefit or relevance to the sites and their stakeholders, communities, and audiences. So this moves us on to the current project. And just before Christmas, Peter and I were able to obtain some further funding, again from Newcastle University, to undertake this work. And really, the purpose of this project is to work with UK sites to further and explore and to actually begin to address some of those issues identified from last year's research. Funding is limited as ever, and it must all be completed by July. So we're under the hammer a bit on this. And crucially, I'd just like to point out that we have deliberately, and as we must, taken this forward in conjunction with colleagues at World Heritage UK and with Matt and James at the UK National Commission. There are three stages to this project. The first, which we actually did at the beginning of February, was to hold an initial workshop for UK coordinators or whoever they felt was most appropriate to put forward to join us. We did that on the 2nd of February, and I think we had about half of the UK's 30-odd sites participated in that. And that was great. There was a lot of enthusiasm for that. The second stage, which we're now supposed to be in, although it's been a little bit delayed because I've been somewhat indisposed over recent weeks due to family commitments, is for the sites themselves to then run a roughly 3-month pilot to test out some of those ideas. So that can run up to the middle of June. And then in the middle of June, we'll have a feedback workshop where sites can report on their experiences, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. And then that'll be followed by the preparation and publication of a report, including findings and recommendations. I thought it would be helpful to perhaps just share with you some sense of what is already happening. I mentioned that there were a number of sites that were, while not explicitly promoting peace, were already doing activity to support the development of greater understanding between and of different peoples and cultures. Saltaire was very interesting. Sheena at Saltaire said, we, the managers of the World Heritage Site, don't really do anything on this, but within our communities, there are a whole raft of international collaborations, community-led, community groups, unsurprisingly for Saltaire, because of the David Hockney connections, a lot of these are arts-based, but they've got a boatload of activity going on of international collections. Fountains have been running very successful World Heritage Day activities, which I think have now expanded into World Heritage Week, or I think it might even be World Heritage Fortnight by now. And that's about talking about UNESCO, UNESCO's objectives, talking about the World Heritage List and the wider World Heritage community. And those have been very, very well received by the public, according to Sarah and Justin at Fountains. Our colleagues north of the border have been doing some fantastic stuff, and I would strongly recommend to you watching these short videos. The first was produced in collaboration with Visit Scotland and is about UNESCO, and it's about the 5 different types of UNESCO designations that there are, and it's an absolute belter. I think it's about 7 or 8 minutes long, well worth a watch. The second is produced by the Antonine Wall itself, Historic Environment Scotland, starring Becky Jones, and that's great because it is talking about particularly their community activities, but Becky very neatly and cleverly interweaves UNESCO's original founding objectives and the objectives of peace. That's a slightly shorter video, but again, well worth a watch. And once again, thanks, Kerry, for putting those links in the chat. Some other examples, as some of you may be aware, the Lake District a couple of years ago came up, about 18 months ago maybe, came up with some very simple display stands. I think there were about 6 of them, outlining UNESCO's objectives, including that of peace. And these display stands went around different venues in the Lake District and stimulated a lot of interest and response from stakeholders and indeed the public and the community at large. Rebecca at Glenavon said, well, and if you look at Glenavon's website, there's very little reference to UNESCO, let alone gender of peace. But Rebecca said, whenever she gives a presentation, the first 3 slides are about UNESCO and why it was founded and its peace objective. And she said the response from all sorts of different audiences is, wow, I never knew that. Oh, wow, that's really interesting. I never understood that. So something very simple that Rebecca just adds in the front of her presentations, magnificent response. Of course, we ourselves have the Living Wall, which at Tully House, which is contributing in no small terms to that theme. And the Tower of London said, hey, we've already got loads of programs for international audiences. And Adrian Phillips from Her Majesty's Royal Palace has said, you know, the way I'm looking at this issue is it's just simply a question of us looking at what we're already doing through a slightly different lens. And I think that's a really powerful and helpful way of people beginning to think about this agenda. So what are the opportunities to do more? Well, we can add, as it says here, some materials onto World Heritage Site websites, and also those, as Rebecca's doing at Glenavon, colleagues can add these into their public presentations. And we can consider how UNESCO's founding objective might be readily woven in to existing activities. And this goes back to the point again from the Tower of London, so that they don't no one has to break step with what we're already doing. I think it's interesting also to consider how this objective may link into other present-day issues about multiculturalism, about come on, what's the word? Gone out of my mind. Yeah, multiculturalism, inclusivity, even issues around modern-day slavery. Just a different way of skinning the cat, if you like. And we can also encourage sites to explore how they might make comparisons or indeed contrasts with other World Heritage sites. And a lot of this can be done through existing linkages. I'll just give you an example from fountains. One of the themes of fountains is obviously about monasticism, but monasticism isn't simply found in the Christian traditions. It's also found in Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, and so there is an opportunity there for fountains to make those sort of comparisons and contrasts with many other World Heritage sites which are representing those particular faiths. I think the other way that the whole concept of World Heritage and through that UNESCO can be brought forward to people's attention is just simply in using the World Heritage List as a resource for formal or informal education. I reckon if you look at the World Heritage List, have a really good look at it. You can find it on the World Heritage website. I don't think there are any subjects on the national curriculum for which you cannot find multiple examples from both cultural and natural sites, indeed mixed sites, which can illustrate aspects of the national curriculum. And another very simple thing, which echoes a lot of what we've been talking about this week, is simply to invite local communities to come up with their own ideas, a la Saltaire, if you like. In terms of benefits to sites, well, I think, and this is sort of again referring back to the World Heritage List and that sort of little example of fountains, I think we on Hadrian's Wall already appreciate the benefits that we have of being part of the FRE, that we immediately have access to and have the opportunity to very naturally tell a far greater story than just the story of the 80 miles long Hadrian's Wall, and a far richer story with comparisons and illustrations from other parts of the FRE. I think there's also an opportunity here to enhance the ability of minorities within our communities, even if they're not already within our audiences, to better relate to Hadrian's Wall. There was some discussion earlier in the week about marking the line of the wall through the west end of Newcastle. And I don't think many people are aware that there is a sizable Romanian community in the west end of Newcastle. And of course, Hadrian's Wall historically has very close links with province of what was then Dacia, Roman province of Dacia, which is now modern day Romania. And that would be a way that we could get those audiences, those sections of our community, perhaps involved, perhaps for the first time, with our World Heritage Site. Again, as John and other colleagues will attest, we have benefited greatly in terms of informing and improving our management practice by our collaborations with colleagues, initially in Germany and Scotland, but more recently with colleagues in Austria, Netherlands, and elsewhere. It really helped us and our not only our management of our site, but things like interpretation, engagement, all this sort of stuff. And so it's a benefit to the management, but it's a benefit to our constituencies and our communities. I've talked about using the World Heritage List as a resource to support formal and informal learning. It's lying there on a plate for educators to use. Go grab it. And also, if we can do anything at all to raise general understanding of World Heritage, what World Heritage status means, what it doesn't mean, etc., what UNESCO is all about, I think that's going to help our communities and individuals within our communities just get a better understanding of what it's all about, and therefore increase their levels of support for what we're trying to do. I think those are all pretty plausible. The next steps, as I've said, we've got this 3-month pilot project started. Some of the other sites have already started doing stuff. Peter and I are in the process of grappling with providing some basic texts for sites to use, and we're trying to make the language as accessible as we can to the general public, while obviously conveying the necessary information. But we're trying to sort of get away from UNESCO World Heritage speak, half of which I don't blooming understand, I'm afraid. And not much of a resource, but I'm available to support World Heritage sites and to advise and comment on any particular initiatives and activities they're undertaking. As I said, we've got the feedback workshop from the pilot scheduled for the middle of June. Its format and structure are yet to be determined, and I think we'll kind of play that by ear, depending on what colleagues want. And then lastly, as I said, we'll have the production of the project report. I think that project report is very important because it's going to be, because it's going to be published, I think it's going to get this onto the agendas of a lot of people in a lot of places across the world, and particularly where this whole subject hasn't featured on people's agendas to date. I think it's also going to be very valuable, and Chris Blanford may have some comments on this, but I think it's going to provide a sort of an evidence base about what has been done with effectively no resource. There's no money to support projects, individual sites to do stuff in this regard. And I think it's going to provide that evidence base of what the potential might be if further resource could be put in to support sites in these endeavours, so that it might be used in case making for funding bids, either by sites individually or more collectively. We're also trying to figure out what kind of feedback we need from the pilot project, and how to answer this question of whether activities have worked. And what do we mean by that? I think it simply means how activities have been received by different audiences. So we're leaving it to the individual sites to gather their feedback and their evidencing as they feel is most appropriate for their circumstances and in relation to their particular activities that they've undertaken. So this leads us with another big fat question, which I have for you. What can Hadrian's Wall do to support UNESCO and its founding objective of the promotion of peace by fostering greater understanding of and between different nations, peoples, and cultures? And I'm pretty sure that Jane would like to say something to that. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for your attention.
David, thank you very much for that really detailed and mind expanding talk, and thank you very much for the managing the tech so well when we had the little blip earlier on. So David warned me that he would be posing the question not just to us as the management board, but to our community here on this call today. That question about, ask not what World Heritage can do for us, but what we can do for World Heritage. And I think it's I would like to assure David and other people working in the UNESCO sphere that actually we do feel at Hadrian's Wall that we have not taken advantage of our designation, and that actually not only is that missing out on the ability for us to form stronger international links, but also it's just wrong that we don't talk about Hadrian's Wall being a World Heritage Site, because that makes us very rare. And so it's sort of missing a marketing trick, never mind missing aligning us with communities of the world. So since I've been chair of the partnership board and worked really closely with John, I mean, literally not very many weeks can go by without John talking about World Heritage, without John talking about UNESCO, without John using the word peace. So actually having our World Heritage coordinator as somebody who genuinely believes that this is the reason, the motivation for him getting up every day and working on Hadrian's Wall, the basis of that is in peace, is actually fantastic for us to have that colleague, because he just threads that into every day of his work. But we're not doing enough, and we want to do more. So before I hand over for discussion, we're in the foothills of our 10-year investment plan for Hadrian's Wall, and it's in that the sort of strategic objectives as opposed to the tactical deployment that we set our stall out. And John conducted some workshops last year with colleagues about what was important to the people who are currently running the attractions and the current partners. So that's colleagues at Vindolanda Trust, at Tully House Trust, National Trust, English Heritage, Northumberland National Park Authority, the local authorities. In other words, people whose sort of day job includes Hadrian's Wall. And then what I can tell you, David, that the three story themes, as we've called it, in other words, the things that we're going to talk about loudly and proudly for the next 10 years are Hadrian's Wall place in the landscape, Hadrian's Wall as a World Heritage Site, and diversity of peoples. So I hope you will take from that, David, that is enshrined in our 10-year strategy. And so many of the things that you will be talking about really are in our hearts, and we'll be manifesting those as we develop the programme. So I would like to, from my perspective, be able to answer David's question to us, which is both challenging and timely. I'm also thinking about that word, the UNESCO, the United Nations, and the significance of that in the current situation we find ourselves in the world. I used to think that actually it was just a sort of post-Brexit thing, that we are a citizen of the world, and that whatever people's views are about our relationship with the EU, we on Hadrian's Wall had our relationship with the world via the United Nations and how important that was. Anyway, that's my perspective on it. So we have some moments left now to be able to discuss this topic. And of course, we've been joined by Chris Blandford, who is giving us our next talk. And Chris is the president of World Heritage UK. So as you can see from the programme, we bookended our conference with the Saturday launch, which had World Heritage in there with Matt from UNESCO. And we close our conference with David's talk and then Chris's talk later on in half an hour's time about the importance of World Heritage. So this is us, in a sense, David, this was us positioning in our conference, positioning us in the context of World Heritage. Anyway, so please now, there's 14 of us on the call, which means that the tech should allow people to unmute and to raise their hands, put something in the chat, but to have a few moments of conversation without the tech breaking, I think, because we can sort of open up this for a chat. So does anybody want to say, John, I know you've unmuted. Would you like to come in, please?
I think it was highly unlikely that I wouldn't say something when the subject was my reason for actually doing this job. It's a Roman site, yes, but primarily it's a World Heritage site. It was chosen to be a World Heritage site in 1987, as you can see from the 30-year anniversary from a few years back. I find it incredibly frustrating that we're retrofitting the subject of peace back into World Heritage sites after all this time. When that was the original raison d'etre for UNESCO and every activity that it did. I think the reason that it dropped off is because it's a difficult thing to measure. And so it got hard, and so people stopped asking the question because you're almost trying to measure a negative. So while peace exists, it's possibly working, and you don't know about it until one slips through the net, and then all of a sudden there's a conflict, as we find ourselves in at this moment in time. I find the word peace really large. I know we've had conversations about this with other colleagues, and so I've tended to do it as the word share, and I find that a much more palatable word. I think that we are there to be shared across the globe, and that's exactly what a World Heritage site for me is. I find it an incredibly simple concept, and it's very straightforward. It's the World Heritage List is a catalogue of human achievement spread across the globe, and the globe is the gallery in which it's set. And once you do that, it's a really straightforward thing to get your head round. In fact, turn the question around and go, how upset would you be if somebody decided to knock down the Taj Mahal? I have no connection, no idea what the Taj Mahal is. I just know that it's important, and I know that if it fell down, we are worse off because of that. If Ayers Rock were damaged, I think we'd know about that and we'd be impacted by that. If they decided to get rid of the pyramids and put houses there, there'd be an outcry. Hadrian's Wall is on that list, and so are the other 1,000 World Heritage sites around the world, because they're of the same standing and because they mean so much to the whole of humanity in that same breath. The only part of the presentation that you gave, David, was in the things that we should not do, is things that was what some of the sites are saying. We should not do things that aren't for our stakeholders. Well, that's fine. Let's get on with World Heritage, because our stakeholders are the globe in that sense, and they are not the stakeholders that turn up to the board meeting. The reason that you're on the World Heritage List is because you are of the human achievement, the whole of humanity. And if you start dividing that up into the people that sit around my board table, then you're missing most of the people that you're designated to look after the site for, in that sense. So we are here to look after Hadrian's Wall on behalf of everybody on the globe. And it's important to everybody on the globe by that standing, by that designation. And that's simply what World Heritage is, and we often forget that. And I just think it's because it's difficult to measure. That's all I want to say. It's absolutely fundamental for me in my thinking about Hadrian's Wall. It's where I start before I even think about Centurion and his sword and whether he's got the right sandals on. I start with, what is the World Heritage Site?
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
John, we'll perhaps not discuss it now, but it would be helpful if over the next couple of weeks or so, we might find an opportunity to talk Turkey in terms of, okay, what can we collectively on Hadrian's Wall do to chip into this pilot? What sort of things might we just try out and see if they work or not?
Absolutely, David. I know that I've not had a chance to talk to you throughout this study. We seem to have just missed each other all the ways. I absolutely don't think it's made up of special events and things like that. I just think it needs to be hardwired into the everyday communications that we do.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other participants on the call would like to add their voice of agreement, dissent, interest, clarification? And Chris, do come in if there's anything you would like to add. Barbara, may I go to you first, please?
Well, yeah, I was just going to mention that it would be very difficult to measure. In 1992, so that's 30 years ago, school curriculum and the exams changed dramatically. So we didn't call it diversity inclusivity then, we called it equal opportunities. And certainly at A level, GCSE level, you had to incorporate all of these things into the delivery of, so school curriculum still are, I presume so, I don't know, it's been a long time since I've been in the classroom, but are still delivering these things. So you couldn't just say study French A level without studying French territories overseas or the rest of it, the war, occupation, resistance. So they have been embedded in school curriculum for a very long time. And measuring it became a ticky box.
Yeah.
You know, and so you went through it, but whether students, pupils, teachers were even aware why they were doing it, I don't know. You know, so it's not really a new idea, but I don't know how you measure it. But it has been embedded in school curricula, certainly for the last 30 years.
Barbara, that's brilliant. Chris,
You know,
you wanted to respond to Barbara?
Yes, I've happily heard David Brough's presentation previously, and I apologize for not being here for all of it this time, David. As I will say later, the whole business of the awareness of World Heritage Sites and what the values stand for is in many ways at the core of our problem now. But I do think that the concept of World Heritage being based in peace, and the words that UNESCO said back in, or UN said in 1946, which I'm sure David has quoted, are critical in raising that awareness. And my sense of it is, and it's a little bit over topical right now, peace and damage to culture is in our faces every day in the paper in Ukraine, sadly. So in a bizarre kind of a way, coming back and reminding everybody of the origins of it, that is peace underpinning World Heritage, I think is really, really helpful. So the initiative that David and his colleagues are taking on, I'm absolutely certain will contribute to that awareness raising, which has been a struggle for quite a number of years for those in the sector.
John.
I just wanted to respond to Barbara and education being a route, and I absolutely agree with Barbara in that stead, because one of the constant challenges that you'll find, or I've found knowing teachers, is the teaching of citizenship here in the UK as a ticky box, and I think that's what you said, Barbara, a ticky box exercise. I've also experienced the teaching of citizenship by, it's a different name, in German schools. And it's very much central and core to the delivery of the education provision. I think when we had Graham Bell earlier in the week, and he talked about that individual that had never left his town, but yet lived in 3 separate countries, I think there's something about the fact where if you live somewhere where conflict happens and it changes and challenges your entire identity, it moves borders around, you can be invaded, and things can change repeatedly. The lessons learned from the post-1945 era and the setting up of UNESCO, the UN, EU, etc., as solutions of peace become more fundamental, and so it's taught with more meaning and depth than a country who's had its borders defined by the end of the last ice age 10,000 years ago and have never changed since. So there's a sort of fixation on the outside of the island's borders as the borders. If you live on the mainland Europe, it's a line across a field that can move any given day. And I think there's a fundamental mindset change in that. And we've got to be aware that we're viewing it from a very isolated position looking out in that sense. So I just wanted to agree with Barbara that yes, there is much more work to do. It is there, but it's a ticky box experience at this moment in time.
Jane,
So
Jane, can I just ask some of the volunteers we have on the call, how aware of UNESCO's founding objectives were they prior to this?
Barbara, Kerry, Barbara, and then Kerry, please. Barbara's shaking.
I was just going to mention, David, it's a good question, and it's something that we ask our WallCap volunteers when they sign up about how much they knew about Hadrian's Wall, and then further on when we have some of the training sessions, we ask about how much they understand about UNESCO's values. But secondary to that, when we ran the Hadrian's Wall Youth Ambassador Scheme last year, the first year that we did it, we had a launch weekend, and part of that weekend, part of the short course requirement is that we cover who are UNESCO. They have to visit a World Heritage Site and look at the skills of a youth ambassador. But this one about UNESCO, I worked with John and we pulled together a presentation that would kind of overview all of what we've been saying. And it was really interesting from my perspective to pull that together actually and present that to a group of young people who had not considered it at all. But what was even more interesting is some of our partner organisations who were helping us deliver this scheme for young people came up afterwards and said, oh, we didn't realise that either. So internally along the World Heritage Site, I think there's definitely we can do more because people come to this line of work and they just get on with it really without perhaps taking that breath to stop, think, reflect, and then understand as well. Because I think we can all chat all day about it and assume that everyone else is on the same page when there are so many degrees of understanding, and it's not through any other reason than it's just not sort of floated across people's desks. I don't think there's a deliberate ignorance or anything to that. It's just one of those things that we just don't, like say, we just don't push.
Well, so we're missing a trick. So Janet says she was aware, but she'd worked in heritage previously. So maybe that it does just filter through. But I think it gives us a massive opportunity as we start really focusing on what we're going to be doing on the wall in the next 10 years.